Bryce Hartwell's hand clamped around Nora Hale's throat so hard the tendons in her neck stood out like wire, and the back of her skull kept striking cinder block with a dull, repeating sound under the flicker of one dying fluorescent tube. Air narrowed to a burning straw. Her boots scraped at tile polished to a hospital shine, rubber soles chirping uselessly while his thumb ground into the side of her windpipe. She got one hand between his wrist and her skin, then lost the angle when he drove her back again. The corridor smelled like disinfectant, burned coffee and copper from the blood she had already coughed into the front of her scrub top. Her pulse hammered against his palm. He felt it and smiled. "Say it," Bryce said, leaning close enough for her to see her own reflection, warped in the black lenses perched on his head. "Say you don't get to tell me anything." Nora tried to answer and produced a torn rasp. She had worked chest wounds in Helmand, with rounds cracking overhead, had packed arterial bleeds in dust storms while the radio screamed for medevac. And none of that training changed one simple fact. In that hallway, at 3:07 a.m., oxygen ruled every thought. Her fingers dug into the tendons of his forearm, searching for a pain point, but his grip only cinched tighter. White sparks flashed across her vision. The flickering light clicked, buzzed, clicked again. His fist came next. Short arc. No wind-up. Knuckles into her cheekbone with the sound of wet cloth, snapped in midair. Her head turned hard. She tasted iron. For half a second she dropped lower, knees folding, and he yanked her upright by the throat, as if he were correcting a dog on a leash. The sunglasses never moved. They sat above his brow like a badge he had bought and mistaken for law. Designer jacket, soft leather, gold watch face catching the bad fluorescent pulse. Expensive everything, including the certainty that no one in this building would stop him. He was right. A transport tech stood 10 feet away with a gurney parked crosswise and both hands still on the rail, eyes locked on the wheel brake as if it required the full measure of his concentration. A resident in wrinkled blues held a tablet against her chest like a shield and took one careful step backward. 3 janitors with yellow carts froze in a line beside the supply closet, mop heads dripping onto grout, while they stared at nothing in particular. 8 contract security trainees in matching black polos watched from the far intersection, radio silent, shoulders rigid, the kind of young faces that had already learned which last names ended careers. The middle-aged night administrator stood under a vending machine sign and studied the swirl in his paper cup, stirring milk into coffee that did not need stirring. 14 witnesses. 1 corridor. No one moved. Bryce dragged Nora off the wall and slammed her back into it with enough force to rattle a framed evacuation map loose on one screw. Her scalp lit with pain. She tried to knee his thigh and missed by inches when dizziness rolled through her. She heard herself make a sound she did not recognize, thin and trapped. He pressed his forearm higher, cutting what little air remained. "You people forget where you work," he said, not looking at anyone except her. "You forget who signs checks." A security trainee shifted his weight, then looked down at his own shoes. Nora's hand found his wrist again. She turned her chin, searching for one cleaner sip of air along the side of his grip, and got half of one. Enough to think one clear, furious thought. Not here, not in front of them. Not while they watched and did math about mortgages and student loans and their own skin. From the stairwell came the sound first, claws skidding, then a low, rolling growl that seemed too deep for an injured chest. The door banged once and rebounded. A German shepherd dragged himself into the corridor, tan and black saddleback coat, darkened with sleet and blood, left hind leg trailing at the wrong angle, his ears pinned forward, his body locked despite the tremor running through his flank. Each breath hitched, shallow and fast, one side of his chest moving less than the other. Atlas. Nora saw him and forgot pain for one stunned beat. He had no business being there, no business still moving. Bryce turned his head, annoyed, then grinned when he understood what he was looking at. "You've got to be kidding me." Atlas crawled another foot, nails scraping tile, eyes fixed not on Bryce but on Nora's face. The growl in his chest thickened, then broke into a cough. He tried to rise, and his left side failed under him. Still, he pushed forward. Bryce kept his left hand at Nora's throat and swung his right boot out in a bored, contemptuous kick that caught Atlas under the ribs with a heavy, echoing thud. The sound bounced off cinder block and ceiling tile. Atlas skidded sideways into the base of the wall, legs scrambling for purchase. A soft cry escaped him before he swallowed it back into a rasping breath. He did not retreat. He dragged himself upright again on 3 working limbs and planted his front paws wide, head low, teeth bared just enough to promise he would spend what little he had left. Nora's vision blurred, sharpened, blurred again. She forced her voice through the pressure on her throat. "Don't," she whispered. It came out broken. "Don't touch him." Bryce looked at her like she had said something funny, then tightened his grip one more notch until black pinpricks crowded the edges of her sight. "You don't give orders," he said. The fluorescent tube popped and dimmed, then steadied to a sickly hum. Somewhere at the nurse's station, a monitor alarm chimed and was silenced. The ordinary machinery of the hospital kept running while a woman in bloodied scrubs fought for air against the son of the man whose name covered the glass walls downstairs. It was the most honest thing about that building. The administrator finally lifted his eyes from his cup. He met Nora's stare for a fraction of a second, then turned his shoulders toward the vending machines and pretended to read nutrition labels. One janitor reached for a radio clipped to his belt, froze when Bryce glanced his way, and let his hand fall. The resident bit her lip hard enough to blanch it and whispered, "Someone call," but never finished the sentence. A trainee took out his phone, not to dial, just to record from chest height, with the screen dimmed. Another angled his body behind him, blocking the camera as if that made it less of a choice. 14 people measured the cost of intervening and decided Nora's airway was cheaper. She tracked exits by reflex even while stars flared in her head. Stairwell door behind Bryce, crash cart alcove 20 feet left, fire extinguisher cabinet mounted shoulder height, oxygen shutoff panel under locked plexiglass, distances, angles, reach. She still did the work because medics did the work even when their own pulse thundered in their ears. Atlas shifted 2 inches closer and braced. Blood marked the tile under him in a broken line from the stairwell to her shoes. Bryce leaned in until his breath touched her cheek. "Look at them," he said softly. "This is what your little speeches get you." Her lungs spasmed. She coughed red onto his sleeve. He recoiled just enough for a sliver of air to slide in, cold and sharp as glass, and she used it to spit one word. "Coward." His expression changed. Not rage first. Surprise. No one in this corridor had called him anything for years except Sir or Mr. Hartwell or whatever title he felt like wearing that week. Then anger arrived, hot and immediate. His hand flexed at her throat. Atlas's growl dropped lower, a warning from a body already near its limit. At the far end of the hall, an elevator dinged. Nobody stepped out. The doors closed again. Nora's hearing tunneled, then widened with an odd, painful clarity. She could pick out the drip from a janitor's mop, the click of Bryce's watch bracelet against bone, the wet pull of Atlas's breathing. She could feel each ridge of cinder block digging into the back of her head. She could see fear on faces that would call themselves decent in daylight. She could see the exact instant each person chose silence over risk. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them touched a radio. Not one of them crossed the tile between safety and duty. Bryce pressed her higher against the wall, feet barely finding traction, and the corridor held its breath with her. Then the stairwell door slammed open hard enough to strike the wall stop, and Mitchell Carson stepped into the corridor in soaked NWU Type 3 camouflage, with rainwater running off his sleeves, one scarred hand on the leash and the other already reaching for Atlas, as if he had been moving toward this exact point all night. The room changed before he took a second step. Nora felt it through the pressure at her throat, through the cinder block at her spine, through the way Bryce's wrist shifted one fraction when his eyes flicked past her shoulder. Mitchell was tall in the practical way, built by years of carrying weight that fought back, broad through chest and back, dark hair cut short with gray at the temples, jawline marked by an old pale scar that caught the fluorescent pulse. His beard was trimmed close. His expression was not angry. Anger would have been familiar to men like Bryce. This was worse. This was measured stillness, the kind that came from someone who had survived nights when panic got teammates killed. Atlas heard him and answered with movement that looked like pain trying to stand up and refusing to quit. The dog's ears rotated forward. His body went rigid again. A low sound rolled from his chest, not loud but deep enough to travel through tile. Mitchell dropped to one knee beside him without taking his eyes off Bryce. Two gloved fingers found the fur under Atlas's neck, then slid to the puncture below the shoulder, checking bleed rate by touch the way medics checked weather by wind. Atlas pressed forward into his hand once, a brief, blunt push. Still on mission. Bryce kept Nora pinned and laughed once, short and sharp. "Hospitals closed to visitors," he said, and there was a tremor under the mockery he did not hear in himself. Mitchell rose slowly. Water dripped from his cuff to the floor in steady ticks. He did not answer. At 3:08 a.m., with fluorescent light buzzing overhead and 14 staff members pretending to be fixtures, silence became its own kind of evidence. A transport tech shifted behind his gurney and glanced at Mitchell's uniform, then at Atlas, then back to the wheel brake he had been studying like scripture. The resident in wrinkled blues swallowed hard and adjusted her grip on the tablet, knuckles whitening in stages. One of the security trainees, the youngest one with a patchy beard and trembling jaw, took a half-step forward before a second trainee caught his sleeve and pulled him back. The middle-aged administrator finally stopped stirring his coffee. The spoon clicked once against paper and went still. Bryce rolled his shoulders, keeping his fingers tight at Nora's throat, and tried to reoccupy the space he had ruled 2 minutes ago. "You lost?" he asked. "This is private?" Nora fought the narrowing tunnel in her vision and locked on Mitchell's face, not because she expected rescue from strangers. She had learned better in too many places. She looked because she recognized operational calm when she saw it, and because Atlas had dragged himself bleeding through a storm to get here, and dogs like Atlas did not gamble on weak hands. Mitchell's gaze flicked once to her neck, counted bruising, assessed airway, then to Bryce's stance, then to the line of witnesses. Distance, angle, exit points. Same math she had been doing while suffocating. He saw all of it in one pass and gave nothing away. Atlas tried to step and stumbled. Mitchell's hand went to the dog's ruff and steadied him. There was reverence in that touch, and command, and a kind of grief that had become muscle memory. Nora got one ragged breath through the side of Bryce's grip. "Atlas," she whispered, the name scraping out like gravel. Bryce tightened again, punishing sound itself. "You don't talk," he said, eyes on Mitchell now. "Neither does he." Mitchell still said nothing. He reached to his vest with his free hand and keyed a shoulder mic, clipped near the seam. No drama. Just one press, one pause, one release. The security trainees saw that motion and looked at one another with open panic because they understood radios and chain of command, even if they had ignored both for the last several minutes. One janitor raised his own radio an inch, then held it there, waiting for permission from a man who did not sign his checks and never would. Bryce heard the click and smirked. "Call whoever you want," he said. "My father owns this place." There it was, the ownership claim. The sentence men like him used as armor, as if a surname on glass turned assault into policy. Mitchell tilted his head a degree, studying him with flat winter eyes that made Bryce's next words snag in his throat before they reached his mouth. Atlas lifted his lip, teeth pale under the sickly light. The dog's coat was tan and black, turned dark as iron in the corridor shadow, wet with sleet and marked by a narrow trail of blood that ran from the stairwell threshold to where he stood now, still braced, still refusing collapse. Nora watched the witnesses watch this exchange and understood, with a medic's clinical clarity, that fear in rooms like this moved by hierarchy. They had frozen for Bryce because he was protected. They were freezing now for a different reason. They were seeing someone Bryce could not bully with a donor wall, and they did not yet know which side of the line would keep them employed by morning. Cowardice had made them still the first time. Calculation made them still now. Mitchell's radio crackled once with static, then a voice Nora could not fully make out under the fluorescent hum. He answered in a clipped murmur too low for the corridor, eyes never leaving Bryce. Atlas leaned his weight into Mitchell's shin and held. The resident finally broke. "She can't breathe," she said, voice thin but audible. It was the first complete sentence any witness had offered since Bryce put Nora on the wall. Bryce snapped his head toward her. "You want to lose your license?" She flinched and looked down. Mitchell's posture did not change, but the temperature in the hall seemed to drop. Even the administrator noticed. He set his cup on the windowsill with both hands as if sudden clumsiness had entered his body. One security trainee muttered, "Sir, maybe we should," and stopped when Bryce cut him off with a glare. Nora felt strength burning down to reserve fuel. Her fingertips tingled, her knees shook. She kept her eyes open by will and habit, and because closing them felt too close to surrender. She caught Atlas looking at her, not at the threat, and saw recognition there so direct it hurt. Yemen dust, field dressings, knights of artillery in the distance, and iodine on her gloves. He remembered scent, pressure, voice cadence. He remembered survival. Bryce jerked her higher, forcing her toes off full contact with tile. "You think I'm scared of uniforms?" he said to Mitchell. "You're in my building." Mitchell took one step forward. Only one. Controlled. Deliberate. That step drew a line no one missed. The trainees straightened. The transport tech finally let go of the brake rail. A janitor thumbed his radio on with a click that sounded louder than Bryce's earlier laugh. The resident backed toward the nurse's station phone, eyes fixed on Nora's face. Motion returned to the corridor in small, stunned increments, as if people were relearning how limbs worked after choosing paralysis. Bryce felt it too and overcorrected, squaring his shoulders, chin lifting, fingers digging deeper in the one place he still had dominance. Nora's vision fractured at the edges. Atlas surged half a step and nearly fell. Mitchell steadied him again, then shifted his own feet into a stance that wasted no movement and promised none by accident. If Bryce had known what that stance meant, he would have released her then. He did not know. Privilege had trained him to read hesitation as weakness and restraint as fear. He mistook composure for bluff. He mistook a man containing force for a man lacking it. Nora heard the distant elevator chime again, and this time someone stepped out, then froze at the end of the hall when they saw the tableau. Donor family son, with his hand at a woman's throat, wounded MWD braced on 3 legs, soaked operator in digital camouflage standing between panic and consequence. 14 witnesses finally deciding whether they had souls left to spend. Atlas's breathing hitched. Mitchell's thumb traced once behind the dog's ear, a signal and a promise. Stay with me. Bryce gave a small, contemptuous shake of his head, as if disappointed by the room's failure to remain obedient. Everybody calm down, he said. She attacked me. No one answered. The lie hung in the disinfectant air and failed to land. Too many eyes had seen too much. Too many phones were now angled without pretense. One trainee who had hidden his screen earlier lifted it openly and began recording with both hands, face set in something like shame. Nora tasted blood and metal and one thin thread of incoming air. She held it, counted, waited. Mitchell's attention moved once more across the hallway, tallying witnesses like grid points, identifying who would speak and who would fold, who needed orders and who just needed permission to stop being afraid. When his eyes returned to Bryce, they carried the finality of a closed door. The corridor had reached that knife-edge second where history decided what name people gave themselves afterward. Bystander, witness, accomplice, responder. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe if you believe forgotten veterans and their dogs deserve loyalty in return, and stay until the end because what happened in that corridor shattered the Hartwell name where it hurt most. Stay with this story, because the next turn begins where most people would have looked away. Nora's boots scraped once against tile. Atlas growled through pain, and Mitchell Carson drew one controlled breath that sounded, in that dead-bright hallway, like the opening of a verdict. And to understand why that breath sounded like a verdict, you had to go back to the beginning. Nora Hale was 36, and by then she could read pain the way other people read weather. She had learned in Helmand, where tourniquets ran out before daylight and medevac windows closed over dust and gunfire, then relearned in quieter ways in Oak Grove, where suffering came under fluorescent lights and insurance codes. At Oak Grove Medical Center, she worked nights because nights paid the differential she needed, and because darkness matched the rhythm her nervous system had never surrendered after deployment. She lived half a mile from the hospital in a wind-beaten farmhouse with peeling white paint, a rusted mailbox that leaned left, and a porch light that burned until sunrise whether she was home or not. Inside that house, her life ran on taped notes and hard rules. A laminated chart above the refrigerator listed her nephew Levi's insulin schedule in block letters. 6:30 a.m., 12:10 p.m., school nurse, 6:45 p.m., dinner dose, 9 p.m., check and correction. Beside it hung a school calendar, a grocery list, and one line written in black marker with enough pressure to score cardboard. Nobody gets left behind. Levi was 9, narrow-shouldered, quick with numbers, terrified of thunderstorms, and still waking some nights calling for the mother he had lost 2 years earlier. Nora would sit on the edge of his bed, count his breaths with him, and wait until his fingers unclenched from her sleeve. At 5:10 every weekday morning, no matter how little she had slept after shift, she packed his lunch, checked his glucose, and signed the reading log for school. She had buried her sister in a rainstorm that turned the cemetery road to mud. She never talked about that day at work. She simply became the adult who stayed. The farmhouse had one heated floor register that worked properly, and a kitchen window that rattled when winter wind came off the fields. But the barn out back was where Nora spent what she called her useful hours. She had converted 2 stalls into rehab bays with rubber matting, overhead slings, and shelves of donated wound supplies sorted in clear bins. Retired military working dogs came through in uneven waves when handlers called in favors or disposition officers quietly passed along names. Arthritic shepherds who flinched at elevator dings. A Malinois with hearing loss, and a panic spiral around men in dark jackets. Dogs who had worked until their bodies failed, and then discovered that policy had no vocabulary for gratitude. Nora made one anyway. Hydrotherapy tubs made from livestock tanks, range of motion, drills, time between Levi's homework and night shift. Hand-cut frozen broth cubes for dogs that would not eat after sedation. By the second week of October, her barn ledger had 12 names and more crossed-out appointment times than she could afford. But she kept writing them in. She and Atlas had crossed paths years earlier in Yemen, before either of them had language for what that contact would mean. Mitchell Carson's element came in at dusk after a compound breach went wrong. 1 man with shrapnel in his leg, 1 with chest trauma, 1 K9 with a torn flank and soot packed under the fur. Nora had been attached to the forward surgical team then, gloved to the elbow, voice stripped to commands and pulse checks. Atlas had tried to crawl toward Mitchell off the litter despite sedation, and Nora had put 1 palm flat between his eyes and said, "Easy, right here." He had gone still under her hand long enough for her to clear debris and stop the bleed. Later, she saw him again outside the triage tent, head in Mitchell's lap, both of them shaking from adrenaline and refusing to admit it. In that world, trust formed fast, or men died. Dogs, too. Back in Oak Grove, years and oceans away, she carried that memory without naming it. Sometimes at 2 a.m. in the medication room, disinfectant sharp in her nose and supply labels blurring from fatigue, she would remember Atlas's eyes tracking her even through pain and feel the old field certainty return for a second. Do the next right thing, then the next. Her co-workers knew pieces of her and respected the parts they could measure. They knew she could start an IV in a moving ambulance and place a chest seal one-handed. They knew she covered shifts when someone's child was sick. They knew she kept trauma shears clipped to her waistband and protein bars in every pocket. Fewer people knew she slept in 90-minute slices because silence still made her skin buzz. Fewer knew she kept her boots lined by the front door in the same direction every night so she could move fast if Levi's monitor alarmed or a dog in the barn crashed. The hospital called her competent. Veterans called her when they had nowhere else to call. On the first Monday after Halloween, Levi brought home a crayon drawing of the farmhouse with 4 dogs around it and wrote in careful block print, "Aunt Nora fixes broken soldiers." She taped it beside the insulin chart and stood looking at it longer than she meant to, one hand still holding a syringe cap. Oak Grove Medical Center sat at the edge of town like authority poured into glass. The trauma wing bore Hartwell letters 8 feet high across the entry. The pediatric tower donor wall carried the same name in brushed steel. Foundation galas happened under those letters every spring, and local news crews filmed checks the size of tabletops, while nurses in scrubs hustled behind them to keep units staffed. The Hartwells funded scholarship breakfasts, Little League uniforms, and sheriff campaign mailers. Their money was in the mortar of the place. Their influence moved through it like current. Nora had learned to navigate that current by keeping her head down and her documentation precise. Then the Disposition Efficiency Initiative arrived with Bryce Hartwell's signature at the bottom and change the temperature of every unit that handled retired service animals. On paper, it was budget reform. Streamlined transfer assessments, reduced holding times, centralized sedation protocols for non-deployable working dogs. In practice, it was a funnel. Aging MWDs came in with incomplete records, were flagged as behavioral liabilities by people who had never handled them, and moved to euthanasia contracts before independent evaluations could be completed. Federal care funds assigned for long-term rehabilitation appeared in procurement ledgers as administrative processing fees. Numbers shifted cleanly. Dogs vanished quietly. Nora first saw the pattern at 1:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, when a Shepherd intake file crossed her station without service history attached. The dog's chart listed unpredictable aggression, non-responsive to command, but the attached vitals showed stress response only during restraint and full compliance with voice cue. The sedation order was pre-signed with Bryce's authorization code. She called Central Records. No answer. She walked to veterinary support. Locked. She asked her charge nurse where the previous 2 dogs from that disposition batch had gone. The charge nurse kept scanning meds and said, "Don't chase this." 2 nights later, Nora asked again, this time in the staff lounge where the coffee tasted burned, and the vending machine hummed loud enough to hide difficult conversations. A respiratory therapist stared at the tabletop and whispered, "They're saying those dogs are too damaged to place." A unit clerk, eyes fixed on the microwave timer, added, "They're saying a lot of things." Nobody said Bryce's name, but everyone heard it anyway. By mid-November, people had started speaking in abbreviations the way scared institutions do. DEI for Disposition Efficiency Initiative. QA hold for charts that disappeared. Special review for anyone who asked where budget lines moved. Nora submitted a formal discrepancy report with timestamps, intake IDs, and 2 scanned sedation forms that did not match the dogs they were attached to. She sent copies through the internal compliance portal and through the Veteran Liaison Office. 24 hours later, HR called her in for a professional conduct meeting about tone in interdepartmental communications. The folder on the table had her name on the tab and nothing else inside. Across from her sat an HR coordinator who would not meet her eyes. 3 days passed before the Veteran Liaison returned her call, voice thin and apologetic. "Your report has been reassigned," he said. "There are jurisdiction questions." Then he lowered his voice. "Be careful." Careful was another word for quiet. Bryce moved through the hospital like a man touring property he already owned. Designer sneakers on polished tile, leather jacket over a tailored shirt with no badge because he did not need one. Sunglasses worn indoors at night, he spoke to staff in directives and euphemisms, and when anyone hesitated, he supplied lineage as credential. "My father built this wing. My father keeps this place open. My father decides who stays employed." The sentence shifted slightly each time, but the meaning never did. By Thanksgiving, even contract security trainees knew not to intervene in any conflict that involved a Hartwell unless a supervisor gave written instruction first. Nora watched good people begin to fracture around that pressure. A resident she trusted stopped signing co-witness notes on animal intakes and asked for transfer to day shift. A janitor who used to leave dog treats in her barn mailbox started crossing the corridor to avoid eye contact. One veterinary tech resigned without notice and mailed Nora a single envelope containing photocopies of supply invoices with altered totals. Nora stored them in a locked file box under Levi's winter blankets. Physical evidence mattered. Chain of custody mattered. She labeled everything with date, time, source, and where she had received it, as if she were still in theater and the after-action review might save someone later. In the first week of December, she made 2 external contacts in one morning after dropping Levi at school: the State Inspector General hotline and a federal contracting fraud line tied to veteran services. She gave names, document numbers, and callback information. One intake operator sounded alert and promised escalation. The other said they were experiencing high volume and could not discuss open matters. Both gave case numbers. Nora wrote them on an index card and taped it inside her locker at work, behind a photo of Levi in a knit hat too big for his head. The outcome came in fragments. The federal line left a voicemail 12 days later requesting secure document submission. The state office sent an email acknowledging receipt and stating review would proceed according to statutory timeline. No immediate intervention, no agents at the door, no abrupt reform, just bureaucracy moving slower than harm. Nora did not stop documenting. She also did not stop showing up for the people in front of her. She taught Levi to count to 10 while an injection stung. She fixed a barn heater with wire and stubbornness. She wrapped an old shepherd's hip in warm compresses at dawn, changed into clean scrubs, and drove the half-mile to Oak Grove with coffee she never finished. She knew exactly how systems broke people down, first by isolating them, then by teaching them their objections would dissolve before they reached daylight. She refused the lesson as long as she could. By the night that corridor turned into a public measure of who would act and who would stare, Nora had already been warned twice, written up once, and shadowed by security on 2 separate shifts for policy compliance support. She had also copied every relevant file she could legally access, logged every missing transfer number, and kept one encrypted drive in her farmhouse freezer inside an empty bag of frozen peas because no one in Oak Grove ever searched where working women hid what mattered. Bryce thought untouchability was inherited like eye color. In Oak Grove, for years, he had been given evidence that he was right. His father sat at the top of the hospital pyramid. The family funded the sheriff, who trained deputies to prioritize de-escalation with community stakeholders, a phrase that translated in practice to hands off the donors' sons. Board members owed campaign favors. Compliance officers owed promotions. Administrators owed mortgages. Every layer protected the one above it. That architecture held until a wounded dog dragged blood across tile and forced witnesses to pick a side in real time. And when that moment came, Nora's story and Bryce's power had already been on a collision course for months, half a mile apart under the same winter sky. The other half of that collision course was Mitchell Carson, and Oak Grove had never really learned how to read men like him. He was 38 when winter settled over Cedar County, hard enough to freeze the ditch water solid, 6 feet even, broad through the shoulders from years under load, with dark hair going gray at the temples and an old scar crossing the left side of his jaw like a pale seam in weathered leather. He wore NWU Type 3 camouflage, whether he was on base, at the feed store, or standing in line at the pharmacy at 6 a.m., with Levi's glucose strips in Nora's town in his cart, and no small talk for anyone. The uniform was not performance, it was containment. He had spent too many nights in places where men died because someone relaxed 1 degree too soon, and civilian clothes made him feel unarmored in ways he could not explain without sounding broken. He slept in 90-minute blocks and woke before alarms with his hand already moving, pulse spiking, lungs pulling air like he had surfaced too late. On the worst nights, he was back in Yemen hearing rotor wash that never arrived, hearing a medic call out vitals over a radio that kept stuttering because procurement had pushed a cheaper relay system through channels no one questioned, until the signal failed under load. He would sit on the edge of his bed in base housing near Oak Grove with both feet planted, counting corners, naming objects, listening for Atlas's breathing in the room beside him. If the dog shifted, Mitchell steadied. If the house stayed too quiet, his skin went electric. By the second week of September, his neighbors had stopped asking why his porch light stayed on until dawn. His service record read clean and clinical in the way records always did. Navy Special Warfare Operator, First Class. 9 combat deployments, 1 Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. But records did not hold the texture of loss, or the way grief settled into the body and changed how a man stood in a doorway. Eli Vance had been his teammate for 6 years, communications and JTAC. The calm voice in his ear when the map dissolved into noise. Eli was the one who passed Mitchell protein bars during overnight planning and left bad coffee on his bunk before first brief. In 2021, during a compound operation outside Al-Mahra, an IED took the lead vehicle and shrapnel cut Eli high in the abdomen. They stabilized him long enough to move. They called medevac. They got delay. Routing issue, procurement system update, authorization bottleneck, words polished for meetings and useless in the dirt. Eli died before the bird arrived. Mitchell carried that timeline in his bones. 13 minutes from blast to first call, 22 to confirmed delay, 41 to silence where his teammate's voice should have been. He had gone still afterward, the dangerous kind of still that made people around him lower their voices without knowing why. At debrief, he answered questions in exact sentences. At memorial, he stood straight and said the right things to Eli's parents. Then he stopped sleeping through a full cycle and started checking every exit in any room he entered, including his own kitchen. The jaw scar came from Yemen, too, a compound breach where a steel hinge blew inward and caught him when the charge overpressured against a reinforced frame. 32 stitches. A medic with dust in her eyelashes and blood up to her wrists had pressed gauze to his face and said, "Stay with me, Carson," in a voice that did not allow drift. He remembered the command more than the pain. He did not remember her name. Not then. After his final rotation, he took administrative duty, then retirement paperwork, then the kind of well-meant appointments institutions scheduled for men they called resilient. Sleep clinic, transition counseling, occupational therapy consultations that suggested woodworking, and breathing apps. He did what he was asked. He sat in chairs under soft lighting and talked around what happened instead of through it. He drove home with both hands, white-knuckled on the wheel, and parked in his driveway until Atlas nosed the passenger door from outside and made him come back to the present. Atlas was not with him at first. That absence almost finished him. When the disposition notice crossed his inbox, it used bureaucratic language that made Mitchell taste metal. Reclassification pending, aging asset, behavioral uncertainty, recommend expedited outcome. Atlas had served 4 deployments and saved more Americans than most people in procurement offices would ever meet. But the system now treated him like an inventory problem with a line item attached. Mitchell filed adoption paperwork the same hour. Denied for procedural deficiency. Refiled with corrected signatures. Delayed for capacity review. Refiled with medical support letters, housing inspection, service history references, and a sworn statement from his former troop chief. He got silence, and then a form response. He drove to the Fort Sailor disposition center twice in 1 week and sat in a waiting area under a television. No one watched, while a civilian contractor explained, "Queue prioritization." Mitchell did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply came back with thicker folders and cleaner documentation and the patience of a man who had once watched a desert road for 19 hours because one missed wire meant a body bag. By early spring, 7 months into the fight, he found the first discrepancy. Atlas's behavioral notes had been amended by a reviewer who had never handled him. By late spring, he had obtained intake camera stills showing Atlas compliant during transfer, contradictory to the aggression flag used to justify euthanasia recommendation. He sent copies to Veteran Advocacy Council and kept originals in a waterproof case beside Eli's folded memorial flag. He learned names of clerks who would answer after hours and names of directors who only returned calls when federal oversight letters were CC'd. 12 months in, he was told to accept another dog because Atlas's profile had complexity markers. Mitchell said no. 18 months in, he was offered supervised visitation in lieu of transfer. Mitchell said no. 23 months in, he appeared in front of a review board in full NWU Type 3, scar visible, hand steady, and read Atlas's service chronology into the record without embellishment. Mission count, detection credits, handler compatibility, medical needs. He did not ask for sympathy. He demanded accuracy. At 26 months, the transfer was approved. When Atlas stepped through Mitchell's doorway that first night, slower than before, left hips stiff and eyes scanning corners out of old habit, Mitchell knelt and put a hand against the dog's chest until both their breathing synchronized. No ceremony, no speeches, just two survivors of the same pipeline, finally in the same room without someone threatening to separate them. Atlas slept against the bedroom door. Mitchell slept, for the first time in years, for 3 hours straight. That was the beginning of whatever healing looked like for men and dogs who had learned to treat rest as a threat. Oak Grove saw the uniform and the scar and decided it understood him. Quiet veteran, disciplined, useful at ceremonies. The town did not see the spirals at 2:13 a.m. or the way he could tell weather shifts by the pressure in old injuries, or the nights he sat on his kitchen floor with his back to the cabinets because Eli's name had arrived uninvited and would not leave. Atlas always found him there. Head against chest, weight applied like an anchor. Stay here. Stay now. By late November, Mitchell had begun volunteering 2 mornings a week at the disposition overflow kennel outside town limits, mostly cleaning runs, lifting feed sacks, and teaching younger handlers how to read stress before it became panic. He did not tell stories unless asked direct questions, and even then he edited for function. What mattered was pattern recognition, ear set, tail carriage, respiratory cadence. The body always signaled before behavior tipped. The same rule had saved men in alleyways overseas and dogs in concrete kennels stateside. Nora first re-entered that orbit as a voice on a phone line just after midnight, clinical and clipped. "You're Carson? I'm Hale. I've got a retired shepherd from your old disposition network with delayed healing and handling aversion. Need a second set of eyes." He drove to her farmhouse in freezing rain and found a woman in worn work boots, blood on one sleeve, and medic hands that moved with battlefield economy. No wasted motion. No panic theater. They worked side by side over a sedated Malinois while Levi slept inside under a nightlight shaped like a rocket. Mitchell noticed the chart on the fridge, the rule in marker. The insulin kit laid out with the same precision as a trauma tray. He recognized discipline built from grief. He did not ask for details. From that night forward, he answered when Nora called, and she answered when he did. Atlas had answered first. He was 9 years old, 87 pounds, German shepherd, tan and black saddleback coat that turned gold in sunlight and dark as iron in shadow. 4 deployments, 23 confirmed lives, saved across Kandahar route clearance operations, and one under-fire child extraction outside a collapsed school wall, where Atlas located breathing under concrete before the secondary team even marked the zone. He had been cited twice in commendation language that sounded formal and bloodless compared to the reality of what he did. Explosive detection under active threat, casualty location in low visibility conditions, handler shielding during contact. He had scars where memory lived. The most significant set near his left hip, where Taliban shrapnel entered during a 2019 compound breach in Kandahar and lodged close enough to nerve that surgeons removed fragments, but left one sliver to avoid permanent motor loss. On cold days, the leg dragged at first step. On loud nights, he favored that side without looking at it. He never failed a command because of it. He only adjusted his weight and kept moving. Later, when disposition officers assessed him for long-term viability, the same injury became a checkbox in a column used to argue decreased value. Mitchell kept the original surgical images in a folder labeled medical, and Atlas could pick that folder out by scent among 20 others because that was where bad rooms began. Service dogs cataloged the world by smell and vibration. Atlas remembered cordite, hot metal, diesel, iodine, rain on concrete, Eli's gloves, Mitchell's sweat when adrenaline spiked, Nora's antiseptic soap from Yemen triage, and the synthetic citrus cologne Bryce wore in hallways where dogs learned not to trust hands. At Fort Sailor, after retirement processing, Atlas had been moved between holding runs with unfamiliar handlers and clipped routines. Feed, walk, assess, sedate when non-compliant. He complied until he didn't, and what looked like resistance in reports was often pain response when strangers grabbed near the old shrapnel track. 3 weeks before the corridor incident, his chart acquired an early sedation notation tied to a transfer review that should never have bypassed independent veterinary sign-off. Mitchell only learned this later from metadata on scanned forms, but Atlas felt it in real time as pattern break. Wrong hour, wrong handler cadence, wrong room prep. Dogs with his history noticed sequence failure faster than people did. On the night sleet hit Oak Grove and roads glazed black, Atlas was brought through a service entrance under low light. A technician, he knew, avoided eye contact. Another carried preloaded syringes and did not call him by name. Atlas's ears pinned, his body locked. He gave one warning rumble and looked for Mitchell. Not present. He looked for known medics. Not present. He caught a trace of Nora's scent on a folded blanket, near a cart, faint and old, likely transferred from prior rehab contact at the barn. For Atlas, that was enough of a map. Then the blade came out, not a surgical instrument prepared on a sterile tray. A utility knife flashed during restraint chaos when he twisted free and the cut landed under the shoulder, shallow at first, then tearing as he lunged. Pain shocked through him. He broke contact, hit tile, recovered on 3 limbs, and moved. No heroics. Pure survival algorithm shaped by years with operators who trained movement under fire until it lived below thought. He cleared a loading bay, dropped from a low platform into sleet, and ran until the left hind leg failed into a drag. Half a mile in winter rain on punctured muscle and compromised breathing was not endurance. It was will. He followed scent memory through mud and field stubble to Nora's farmhouse porch, collapsed against her door, and struck it once with his shoulder hard enough to wake the house. Levi heard the thud first and called for his aunt. Nora opened the door with trauma shears in one hand and went to her knees before her brain caught up to what her eyes were seeing. "Atlas," she said, and he shoved his head against her thigh with a force that said home. "Help, now." She got him onto a blanket sled, dragged him into the kitchen, and had gloves on within seconds, pressure dressing in place within 1 minute, airway assessment while Levi brought the insulin, kit table lamp for better light because he knew her commands by heart. "Stay with me," she told Atlas. The same words from Yemen years earlier, and his breathing steadied 1 notch under her hand. At 2:41 a.m., she called Mitchell. He was already halfway out the door by the second ring. By 2:58 a.m., Atlas had enough stabilization to transport, and Nora had body cam footage running because she did not trust the institution she was about to enter with a wounded, retired MWD whose paperwork had already been manipulated once. She loaded copies of intake discrepancies onto an encrypted drive in her scrub pocket. Physical evidence, external records, timestamps. She brought everything because experience had taught her that truth without documentation got buried under donor names. When they reached Oak Grove, Atlas smelled Bryce before he saw him. Synthetic citrus over leather, elevated cortisol under arrogance. He growled low, a warning that started in damaged lungs and still carried authority. The rest of that corridor followed. Forgotten heroes did not forget. They tracked the scent trail back to the people who had failed them and the few who had not. Atlas's growl dragged through the corridor like gravel under a tire, low and stubborn and alive, and Nora felt the sound in her ribs even while Bryce Hartwell's hand kept crushing her airway against cinder block. The whole scene was the same flickering fluorescent tube, the same disinfectant sting in her nose, the same copper taste climbing the back of her throat. But now every face had history attached to it, and history made the silence uglier. The transport tech by the gurney had a daughter in braces and a second job on weekends, and he still stared at that brake lever instead of the fingers closing on a woman's neck. The resident who had whispered she couldn't breathe had 6 figures of debt and a Hartwell scholarship line in her file, and fear held her in place like a hand between her shoulder blades. The janitor with the radio had left dog treats in Nora's mailbox last month, then froze when Bryce turned his head. The administrator by the vending machine had signed the memo that called euthanasia efficiency. Nora knew all of that now, and none of it changed the physics. Oxygen still decided everything. Bryce's thumb bit harder under her jaw. Her pulse slammed against his palm in frantic, uneven beats. She tried to wedge 2 fingers under his wrist and found only tendons like steel cable. Her boots scraped once, twice, a dry rubber cry on tile. The back of her skull hit block again, and white sparks burst across her vision. Atlas hauled himself forward 6 inches on his front legs, left hind leg dragging behind him like dead weight. Blood from the wound under his shoulder streaked the floor in broken commas. He coughed, swallowed, and bared his teeth anyway. Mitchell kept one gloved hand in Atlas's ruff, not restraining, anchoring. At 3:09 a.m., the wall clock above the nurse's station clicked the next minute, and nobody in that corridor could pretend this was confusion anymore. Nora caught one sliver of air along the edge of Bryce's grip, enough to hear him breathing fast through his nose, enough to smell the synthetic citrus cologne Atlas had followed out of a service bay and through sleet. Bryce kept trying to perform control for the room, chin up, shoulders broad, sunglasses still perched on his head like he believed expensive things made him bulletproof. But his wrist had shifted when Mitchell appeared. His stance was wider now, compensating. He was afraid. He just hadn't admitted it to himself yet. Mitchell stood square in soaked camouflage, rainwater still dripping from the cuff of his sleeve and darkening the tile at his boots. He did not crowd. He did not flinch. He looked at Nora's neck once, catalogued bruising and skin color, then looked at Bryce's grip, then at Atlas's breathing pattern. His face stayed unreadable, the scar along his jaw pale under the sick light. In another world, that stillness would have been courtesy. Here it was warning. A security trainee near the far intersection finally raised his radio to his mouth. His voice came out cracked. "Code Gray, 3rd floor East Corridor, staff assault in progress." He let the last word hang as if saying it aloud might cost him his job. Bryce snapped his eyes toward him without releasing Nora. "Put that down." The trainee didn't. Something in the room shifted then, subtle and irreversible. Not courage all at once, a sequence. The resident backed toward the desk phone and hit speaker with shaking fingers. One janitor stepped his yellow cart aside, clearing the corridor lane like he was clearing an airway. The transport tech unlocked his gurney wheels and moved 2 feet closer to Nora, not enough to help yet, but no longer pretending the break was the center of the universe. Nora's vision tunneled again. She forced her eyes to Atlas. His ears were pinned forward. His chest rose shallow on one side, then caught. Every breath looked expensive. He met her gaze with battlefield focus that ignored pain and asked only one question. "Hold?" She answered by staying upright. Bryce felt the room peeling away from him and doubled down on the only leverage he had left. He jerked Nora up by her throat until her heels barely brushed tile. "Nobody moves," he said, voice louder now, aimed at the witnesses. "She attacked me. You all saw it." No one answered him. No one agreed. Mitchell took one quiet step to his left, opening angle on Bryce's dominant hand. His free hand stayed low, empty, visible. Atlas shifted with him, front paws spreading for balance, body trembling from blood loss and effort, but still aligned to command posture. Mitchell's thumb brushed once behind the dog's ear. Signal received. Nora heard the elevator ding at the end of the hall. 2 lab techs stepped out with specimen coolers, saw Bryce's hand at her throat, saw Atlas bleeding, saw Mitchell in camo, and backed into the elevator without a word. The doors closed on their faces. Cowardice had become choreography in this building. Bryce followed Mitchell's movement and tightened reflexively. Pain flared from Nora's neck into her jaw and down her shoulders. Her hands went numb for a second. She forced one of them to move, pressed her thumb hard into the notch between Bryce's forearm flexors, got a twitch, not release. Her lungs clenched. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a fast drum losing rhythm. Mitchell saw the loss of color in her lips and made his decision. He lifted his chin a fraction. His voice came out level, low enough that everyone had to listen. "Let her go." 3 words, no heat, no negotiation. Bryce laughed, but the sound broke halfway through. He kept his grip and gave Nora's throat one sharp squeeze, punishment for being challenged in front of people he considered property. "You deaf?" he said. "My father owns this hospital." There it was again, the family name used as shield, tossed into the corridor like law. Mitchell did not blink. Rain ticked from his sleeve to the floor. His eyes stayed on Bryce with the flat concentration of a man who had already run the outcome 6 different ways and disliked all of them except the one in front of him. Atlas rose. Not cleanly. Not without cost. He pushed off his right hind leg, dragged the injured side under him, and came up into a rigid, 3-point stance beside Mitchell's knee. His head lowered, ears forward. Teeth visible now, not in panic, but in disciplined threat. The growl in his chest, built from damaged lungs and still carried command weight. Every witness stepped back at once. Bryce glanced down at Atlas and scoffed, trying to recover contempt. "That dog can't even stand." Atlas took one deliberate step forward. Bryce's scoff vanished. He had never been close to a working dog in true command posture, never watched an animal choose pain over retreat, because the man beside him asked for one more second. He looked back at Mitchell, searching for bluster, for drunken rage, for any familiar signal he could manipulate. He found none. What he found was worse. Mitchell's eyes held that winter's stillness men in violent rooms recognized one heartbeat too late. No adrenaline scatter, no ego, no need to prove anything, only precise intent and absolute permission to finish what started if the threat continued. Bryce had spent his life around men who threatened to call lawyers. He had never stood across from a man who calculated distance to his wrist, weight transfer, airway time, and witnessed sight lines in the same breath. Nora felt Bryce's fingers shift again, minute but real. Blood returned to one side of her throat in a hot rush that hurt almost as much as pressure. She sucked in half a breath, coughed, and tasted iron. Her knees tried to fold. She stayed vertical by leaning into cinder block and stubbornness. Mitchell spoke again, same calm, same volume. "Final warning." The corridor went silent enough to hear Atlas's breath hitch. A siren chirped faint in the distance outside, then another closer, reflecting off the ambulance bay doors. Someone had finally made the external call stick. The resident at the phone whispered unit location to dispatch with her hand over her mouth. The trainee with the radio repeated, "Assault in progress. Victim compromised airway." And this time his voice was steadier. Bryce heard the approaching response and panicked behind his sneer. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said louder, pitching his words at the cameras now pointed at him. "My father runs this place. The sheriff answers to us. I say she came at me, that's what happened." No one echoed him. Mitchell shifted one foot barely, loading his back leg. Atlas mirrored the movement with a low rumble that vibrated through tile. Nora saw Bryce finally register the synchronization, handler and dog moving like one system despite blood, despite exhaustion, despite the entire corridor shaking itself awake around them. Bryce's confidence cracked in plain view. He looked from the phone's recording to the radios transmitting to the man in front of him, who had not raised his voice once. He looked at Atlas's eyes, bright and fixed and utterly unconcerned with personal safety. He looked back at Mitchell and found no hesitation there, only a quiet, professional certainty that made his expensive sunglasses and donor wall surname feel suddenly small. For the first time that night, Bryce Hartwell understood that he was not in control of this room anymore, and the understanding landed on his face like cold water. Bryce's fingers loosened for the first time when Atlas drove a bark through torn lungs and surged one hard step closer, teeth inches from Bryce's wrist. "Now," Mitchell said. The word landed like a switch thrown in a dark room. The trainee with the patchy beard moved first, radio still in one hand, and grabbed Bryce's elbow from behind. The transport tech came off the gurney and caught Nora under her arms as her knees gave way. Bryce tried to wrench free and shouted at everyone at once, "Don't touch me! I told you who I am." His right hand came up as if to strike again, and Atlas launched just far enough to clamp Bryce's jacket sleeve at the forearm and pin it against the cinder block. No tearing flesh, no frenzy, pure control. Bryce froze, breath stuttering, staring at the dog that couldn't even stand and now held him immobile with surgical precision. Mitchell didn't look at Bryce. He dropped to Nora, 2 fingers at her carotid, eyes on skin color and airway swelling. "Nora, stay with me." She coughed, a wet tearing sound, and pulled in air that scraped like glass. "Atlas," she rasped. "He's on task," Mitchell said. "You breathe." The resident was at Nora's side now, finally, opening a trauma kit with shaking hands. "Neck bruising, possible laryngeal injury," she said into the desk phone speaker. Need respiratory and attending now. Footsteps thundered from the stairwell. 2 county deputies hit the corridor, saw Bryce pinned, and stopped short. Deputy Lyle Sutherland's eyes flicked from Bryce's face to the Hartwell name badge on the wall map, then to Mitchell's uniform. He hesitated exactly 1 second too long. Bryce found his voice. Arrest him. Arrest both of them. She attacked me and that dog. Easy, Mitchell said to Atlas, and the dog released the sleeve but held position, rigid and ready. Deputy Sutherland cleared his throat. Mr. Hartwell, maybe we de-escalate and handle this internally. The resident looked up from Nora's neck with pure disbelief. He had her off the floor. The trainee with the radio stepped forward, jaw still shaking but set now. I called Code Gray. I saw him choke her. Same, the janitor with the treat said, raising his hand like he was in school. And I saw him kick the dog. The middle-aged administrator by the vending machine stared at his own shoes. Mitchell stood slowly, blood on his glove from Atlas and rain still dark on his cuffs. Deputy, he said, voice level. Federal evidence is in play. Retired MWD assault, procurement fraud, attempted homicide. You touch chain of custody wrong, you own it. Sutherland's chin lifted. You don't tell me my job. Mitchell keyed his shoulder mic again. This is Carson. Scene active. Request state investigator and federal liaison at Oak Grove East Corridor. Witness count 14 plus responding staff. Body cam and harness cam recording confirmed. Static cracked, then a woman's voice answered clear enough for everyone to hear. Received, Chief Carson. State Inspector General team is en route with Federal Contracting Task Unit. Preserve scene. No local release. Bryce's face drained. What task unit? Nora swallowed pain and forced words through swelling. The one I called. Sutherland's hand hovered near his cuffs, then dropped. By 3:27 a.m., the corridor smelled like saline, wet wool, and fear. State investigators arrived in plain jackets with hard cases and evidence seals. A federal contracting agent followed with a tablet already open to case numbers Nora knew by heart. The federal fraud line operator she had spoken to in December stepped into frame on a secure video call and confirmed her prior intake, timestamp, callback log, and requested document transfer. Ms. Hale submitted supplemental metadata 12 days ago, the operator said. We flagged Hartwell procurement codes at 1842 yesterday. The investigator turned to Nora on the gurney. Do you still have original files? In my scrub pocket, she whispered. Encrypted drive. Duplicate at Farmhouse freezer. Inside frozen peas. Labels fake. Logged, the investigator said. Mitchell handed over his waterproof case. Original disposition appeals. Atlas reclassification amendments, reviewer signature mismatch. Logged, the agent said. A vet tech who had resigned without notice appeared at the corridor entrance with a manila envelope clutched in both hands. She looked at Nora, then at Bryce, and finally stepped forward. Photocopied invoices, she said. Altered totals. I mailed copies once. These are originals from my locker. Logged. The trainee who had filmed secretly lifted his phone and didn't hide it this time. I've got the whole thing from when he hit her. Upload link sent, the investigator said. Do not delete local. The administrator by the vending machine was asked if he had seen the assault. He opened his mouth, closed it, and said, I was looking at my coffee. The investigator's expression didn't move. Noted as non-cooperative witness. He never gave more than that. At 5:40 a.m., as dawn turned the east windows from black to steel gray, Bryce was walked out in flex cuffs past the wall where Hartwell Trauma Center glowed above the lobby doors. He kept shouting that his father would end careers by lunch. No one answered him. Atlas watched from a blanket beside the nurse's station, IV line taped to his foreleg, eyes unblinking. By noon, the hospital board filled conference room A under emergency call. The same administrator sat at the far end, silent. The resident testified first, voice steadier now. The janitor testified next, then the trainee with patchy beard, then the transport tech who admitted he had frozen until Mitchell stepped in. Sutherland was placed on administrative leave before he finished his statement. The sheriff's office counsel read the order in a flat voice and collected his badge. State investigators projected still frames from 3 synced sources onto the wall. Nora's body cam from the farmhouse treatment and intake, Atlas's harness camera from the stairwell crawl, and corridor phone footage from 2 angles. In one freeze frame, Bryce's hand was locked at Nora's throat, while his sunglasses sat on his head like a crown. In another, his boot was striking Atlas under the ribs. His father stood when that image appeared, face red, and demanded adjournment. The board chair shook her head. "Sit down, Director Hartwell. You are recused pending criminal review." At 2:16 p.m., by recorded vote, the board terminated Director Hartwell for cause, referred procurement records to state and federal auditors, and ordered immediate removal of the family name from trauma and pediatric donor displays as potential evidentiary contamination. Maintenance crews unscrewed the brushed steel letters before sunset. The adhesive shadows stayed on the glass like old bruises. 17 days later, the sentencing hearing packed courtroom 2. No cameras allowed inside, but every bench was full of night shift staff, veteran handlers, and people who had once gone quiet. Bryce stood in county khaki, no sunglasses, hands folded too tightly at the rail. He pled to attempted homicide, federal fraud conspiracy, evidence destruction, and cruelty to a retired service animal under plea terms that required full financial disclosure and asset forfeiture. When the judge asked if he understood the conditions, Bryce answered, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice smaller than anyone in Oak Grove had ever heard. Then the prosecutor moved to the final exhibit, a declassified Yemen medevac delay packet, newly unsealed for sentencing context because procurement failures were part of the fraud chain. Names rolled across the monitor. Petty Officer Eli Vance, delayed rotor authorization. Field medic, intervention attempts. Nora went still in the second row. Mitchell, beside Atlas, looked at the medic line and stopped breathing for one suspended beat. Corporal Nora Hale, Army combat medic, forward surgical attachment. She turned her head toward him slowly, eyes bright but steady. "Eli was yours," she said. Mitchell nodded once. The scar in his jaw tightened. "You were the one with gauze on my face." "I told you to stay with me," she whispered. "You did." The judge's gavel came down. Sentence entered, and it sounded less like punishment than closure finally arriving with paperwork attached. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp enough to sting. Levi stood on the steps in a blue knit hat, insulin kit bag slung crossbody, the way Nora had taught him, supervised by the school nurse and one of Nora's neighbors. He spotted Atlas first. "Atlas!" he yelled, then checked himself and lowered his voice to a respectful stage whisper. "Hi, soldier." Atlas lifted his head, ears forward, and crossed the distance with a controlled limp. He pressed his muzzle into Levi's mittened hand, then turned and leaned his full weight into Mitchell's chest. Mitchell wrapped both arms around the dog's neck and held on without speaking. Nora came down the steps, knelt to Levi's level, and checked his glucose monitor out of habit. "You good?" 118, he said proudly. "Perfect." She stood, looked at Mitchell, and for the first time since the corridor, her shoulders dropped from combat height. Not because the world was fixed, because this piece was done. Across the street, workers from facilities loaded the last Hartwell letters into a truck bed, tagged for evidence storage. The janitor, who had once frozen by his cart, raised a hand to Nora. The resident raised one to Mitchell. The trainee with patchy beard stood with his parents and did not look away from anyone. Some people spoke when it counted, some never did. The record held both. Atlas exhaled against Mitchell's sternum, a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a mission clock finally stopped. Nora set one hand on the dog's shoulder, the other on Levi's insulin bag, and the three of them stood in the cold with a veteran who had carried one war too long and a dog who had crawled half a mile to put the right survivors back in one room. If you stayed for the end, you knew what Oak Grove learned too late. Names on buildings could buy silence, but they could not outlast evidence, loyalty, and one wounded German shepherd who refused to leave anyone behind.